for Outside In Murals Inspired by Dalí. But before we start, we would like to thank the City of St. Petersburg for their continued support. Thank you, St. Petersburg. And also a special thanks to our members who make events like this possible. Thank you, members. And a very special thank you to our sponsors who made this Outside In new exhibition possible. Hal Friedman, thank you. Willie Ruderowski, Joanne Obenoff, the Guild at the Dalí, our Board of Trustees, the annual fund keeper of the collection donors, and once again, the City of St. Petersburg. Thank you all. Please visit our website, thedalí.org, for more information about online activities and programming, including these upcoming events. This is our July calendar. On Sunday the 6th, we have the Little Surrealist Tour. Once someone purchases a general admission, you can meet the docent upstairs by Daddy Longlegs of the Evening Hope for a guided tour for your little ones, ages 7 to 11-ish. But adults love the tour too. And then also on the 10th, we have a very special Poetry at the Dalí, our open mic series. If you would love to, spill a little poetry. If you're a poet and you know it, you want to show it, that whole spiel, come early so that you can sign up. And this room is usually packed, but it's a very fun night. Then on the 17th at 5 p.m., we have our fun, surreal summer nights at the Dalí. We have a DJ, there's music, it's also during our discounted hours. And also on the 20th, we have yoga at the Dalí at 9 a.m. If you need some peace and quiet, definitely join us for yoga. Then on the 22nd, we have our first, at least since I've been here a couple of years, our first sound healing session with art. And that is actually in the Huff Gallery, in the Outside In exhibit. It is selling out really quickly. So if you're interested in sound healing and meditation, and you would love to lay on a yoga mat, listen, let the vibration soothe you, definitely go on our website to purchase a ticket for that event. On the 29th, we have another big event, which is Flavors of Spain, featuring Black Pearl Restaurant. That is wonderful if you are a foodie and you just want to enjoy the Dalí and eat, definitely get a ticket for that event. And then another special announcement, just to make sure everyone is aware, we have select nights in July where you can attend the Dome show, the Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon, our immersive show, which is not every day of the night. So definitely go on our calendar of events so that you can see the date and times for this. And it pretty much sells out early. So you may not be able to get a ticket for this week, but you can possibly get one for next week. Also, be sure to join us for our next Coffee with the Curator, which is an artist talk featuring artists Chad Mize, Miss Crit, and Naomi Harberland. These three artists will be here for our next Coffee with the Curator to speak about their experiences and what inspires them from Dalí and their experience, their lifelong commitment to the surreal. I don't know if they'll all say that, but that's how I see it. They are the artists who are featured in the Outside In Murals exhibit. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Jenee Priebe. Founder of No Good Deeds Art, she has built a reputation as a regional leader in arts administration and event management, with particular emphasis on murals and public art. With over 7 years of experience as a leader, organizer for Florida's renowned mural festival, SHINE. And if you're from St. Pete, all these murals that you see around our beautiful city, Jenee had a hand in making all of it possible. So I just want to say thank you for that specifically, because I've done mural tours. It's wonderful. And through her boutique firm, No Good Deeds Art, she offers public art consulting, project management, artist recommendations, and mural tours. Priebe has assisted in the curation of mural programs for other municipalities, including Pinellas County, City of Clearwater, City of Pinellas Park, and others. She also serves on the board of directors for the Florida Association of Public Art Professionals. Please join me in welcoming Jenee Priebe.
All right, good morning. Thank you all for being here. Joy, thank you for the introduction. My name is Jenee Priebe. I'm really honored to be here with you all today. My main goal today, this is me, I already talked about all that. My main goal today is to kind of talk a little bit about the evolution from graffiti to street art to muralism, kind of define some of these terms a little bit more clearly, talk about how SHINE fits into all of that. As Joy mentioned, my background is with the SHINE Mural Festival. I was the director of the festival for 7 out of the last 10 years, so was able to be really involved in just the kind of street art culture here in St. Pete, but also kind of beyond, bringing in international and national artists. So that's kind of the goal. I want to help define some of these terms too, because I think we use them sort of like interchangeably sometimes. And then, as Joy said too, if you haven't already seen the exhibition upstairs, highly, highly recommend going to check that out. So we're going to start with graffiti and just kind of understanding in a broad sense what graffiti is, right? Because this is really the foundation of why we're here today, why this exhibition is here today. But graffiti is largely done illegally. It's usually name-based or text-based. There are characters involved, especially as time goes on, but initially it was really kind of based in more of a text writing form. The audience for it is really meant for other writers, not necessarily for the general public. Originally it was done with a lot of markers or aerosol, applied directly to surfaces. The goal is to be seen far and wide, right? The more you can get your name out there, the better, the more fame you have as a graffiti writer. It's often associated with danger and risk. The more really dangerous places that you can get your name, the more notoriety you have within the community. And it's really a personal expression or to market territory. Graffiti is temporary in nature. And then street art, and we're going to go into detail on all of these things, but just to kind of like start out with some of these broader definitions. Street art, and I'm also going to define street art maybe a little bit differently than what you might see on the internet or might hear in other places, just from my lens of working in this culture. I think street art, usually murals kind of get folded into this definition of street art, but for this purpose, I'm going to break them out into their own category. So that's why it could be illegal or permission, because murals tend to be permissioned, but street art tends to be more illegally done, like graffiti. But it's more image or character based than graffiti. It's meant for a broader public audience, tends to have more of a political or social messaging behind it, and then you start to see a wider variety of mediums being used, right? You see stencils, you see wheat paste. You do see bucket paint with graffiti and with street art, but you might see a little bit more of the bucket paint with street art, and of course aerosol as well, also temporary in nature. And then murals, as I mentioned, I'm going to break them out into their own category because that's really what I've seen over the years doing this work. I think they deserve their own category. They tend to be done legally. They're more image or design based. They can also include text, meant for a broad public audience, usually made with bucket paint or aerosol. Oftentimes, murals are commissioned. You might see that by a property owner or by a city or municipality. Oftentimes, they're branded or used to represent the business or the property that they're located on. You might also see a lot of themes, even with the show here at the Dalí, right? We have this theme of Dalí. Oftentimes, they're historical, or they might represent the local flora and fauna. Also temporary, but maybe not as temporary as graffiti or street art. I'm also going to just throw in public art too, because I think with street art and public art, they tend to be kind of these catch-all phrases that You might hear often when we talk about murals, you might hear someone call it public art. You might also just hear them say street art, but they could all be talking about murals. But for the purposes of this and the way that the city of St. Pete itself defines public art, they don't necessarily include murals in that definition, although in other places that is pretty common to have murals be considered public art. But it's always legal. They're considered permanent pieces of art, right? This is where the major distinction, where it's not meant to be temporary. At least here in the city of St. Pete, temporary means that it would last for 25 years or longer outside. It's usually made with heavier materials for that purpose, so they can withstand the harsh outdoor elements, particularly here in Florida. You see a lot of steel or concrete, tile. These tend to have much larger budgets, so you see them commissioned by cities or municipalities primarily. It can be indoor or outdoor, like the city of St. Pete, and many cities have indoor and outdoor pieces that are part of their public art collection. We won't really talk more about that, but just kind of, I think it's important to mention because, again, you'll hear murals kind of fall under this definition of public art, as well as street art. So kind of going back to ancient times, right, which I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on this, but writing on walls goes back, to cave days. But what I think is important about that is that you often see works depicting the culture of that time, right? Rites of passage, traditions, maybe even clues to clothing and other cultural traditions that you might find in times that we don't have access to anymore. So you get a glimpse into some of these earlier cultures, right? This is a fresco mural that dates back to maybe 30 BC. So people have always been writing on walls. It's not necessarily new. But as we move into more contemporary times, we'll start talking about sort of what happened in Mexico in the 1920s, 1940s. You see this, after the Mexican Civil War, the government started commissioning murals as a way to communicate to people, right? So the literacy rates were really low. So using visual images was a great way to reach out to people and start educating people if they couldn't read. So they wanted to really unify people, bring people together, empower people, and use it as a tool for education. So this is a mural here by Diego Rivera, who you probably are familiar with, married to Frida Kahlo, very influential Mexican artist. And then this started to inspire murals in the United States around the 30s and 40s, right? So here we're in the Great Depression, also very high unemployment rates. Franklin Delano Roosevelt launched the New Deal as a way to kind of revive the economy at that time and included artists in that, which is amazing. So a lot of these artists and mural artists were being commissioned to create works just to stimulate the economy and keep people employed. So you see a lot of these murals at public office or public buildings like post office, schools, courthouses, libraries, right? And this is, again, kind of in the 30s and 40s. All right, and now we're going to get back to sort of what we think of as graffiti in our modern times. So really we're looking at the late 1960s, early 1970s. We see what we think of as the earliest graffiti writers. There's some contention about who was the first writer ever. Some people say Cornbread, who is based in Philadelphia, was the first graffiti writer. Some people say Taki 183 in New York City. I don't know, I've seen both things. But it may have started in Philadelphia, but I think New York City is where we really see the culture of graffiti really start to take on and grow from there. But really the goal of graffiti, like I mentioned before, is getting up. You want to get your name seen in as many places as you possibly can, which is why subway cars became such an integral part of graffiti culture, right? Because you can write your name once and have it spread all over the city and be seen from all over in different boroughs. Rather than just tagging the back of a sign or maybe a subway station or something like that. You can get a lot more visibility that way. I think it's cool too to mention that this article that came out in the New York Times in the early 70s that featured Taki 183. So he was I think he was 17 at the time, and he was a messenger, so he would go all over the city and he just started writing his name. So he's Greek, his first name is Demetrius, he's never revealed his last name, but Taki is sort of a common Greek nickname, essentially. And 183 was the street that he lived on. So he started tagging that everywhere he'd go throughout the city while he was doing his work. And the New York Times picked it up and published an article about it, and how there was a lot of other young kids at that time too that were also writing their names and maybe their street name as sort of a way of communicating with one another. This article really starts pushing graffiti into the mainstream consciousness for really the first time. And I think that that's cool to mention, because all of this, we see it with murals, we see it with graffiti, but like the documentation of it is such a huge part of the culture itself, right? And being able to expand beyond just wherever you're located. The other thing into the early 80s was there was a book which I brought called Subway Art that was published by Martha Cooper and Henry Chalfant, that was years worth of photos that they had taken in New York City of the subway cars, which is really, really incredible. I highly recommend, if you haven't read this, to check it out, because just the amount of cultural documentation that's in there. Like, my background's in anthropology, so I just find all the culture around it really fascinating. But the amount of effort that went into just photographing these images too, right? These are on train cars, they're zooming across the city. They would wait for hours and hours and hours in hopes of getting one photograph, which again, at the time, nobody was really doing that, but they had built these relationships with these graffiti writers in New York City, so they knew when the trains were coming, they knew where they would be if they were running at all. And again, this is a very, very temporary art form, and so if you're lucky to catch a photo of it all, it's a pretty big deal. But when this book was published, we really start to see graffiti spreading worldwide, right? It really caught on in Europe, and it's not that there weren't people writing on walls in other places, but you start to really see these individual styles develop, and the culture behind it really starts to explode. And also, because there were so many really young kids at that time writing their name and their street number, or just their name, it became important to kind of distinguish yourself from other writers, and that's where you really start to see the style develop over time. So getting into graffiti a little bit more, I have a couple examples here from a local writer named Tasco, but your tag or your hand style, which is this one up here, is really the foundation as a graffiti writer. You really want to have a well-defined, stylized tag before you start doing more elaborate pieces. So this is really where it begins. Once you've sort of mastered that, you have a stylized tag, you might move into more complex pieces like these, like bubble letters or throwaways, which again are still pretty simple. You might see just like a single color with an outline, right, is kind of defined as a throwaway or throw up. And then that'll evolve into more wild style pieces, which are these really detailed pieces that might have, these highlights and the shadows and all the little detailing in there. Also called a masterpiece or a piece. Graffiti has a whole language of its own. These are just a couple different examples of things that you might hear, like all city, to be known all across the city. To buff is to paint over or remove graffiti. A toy is somebody that's an incompetent painter or maybe a new painter. Bombing is to paint a whole lot of walls around town in a short period of time. And then a crew is sort of like a loosely organized group of painters that maybe learn from each other, support each other, and then you'll tend to see a lot of crew tags in the more in some of the pieces, like down here, you see these are like little crew tags there. Okay, so then again, this is kind of like in the 80s, we start to see the emergence of hip hop. So hip hop becomes a very closely connected culture with graffiti. This is starting in the Bronx, right? This is largely African American and Hispanic communities that are growing this culture. And then graffiti gets adopted as sort of one of the main elements of hip hop. Again, depending on what you look at, there's a different number of elements in hip hop, but the four major ones are DJing, MCing, breakdancing, and graffiti. So again, graffiti is kind of a natural fit for hip hop because you start to see this this personal expression really coming out, right? And especially in with graffiti being more of like a rebellious art form, kind of defiant, right? It is technically vandalism. But what's also happening is that this is being done largely by young kids that are economically disadvantaged, probably disenfranchised in some ways, right? Which is also sort of where hip hop culture is coming from as well. And they're using this art form to communicate messages about their lives. And at the time, well, even still, that's not what I wanted to do. Hip hop, I don't know how to scroll on my notes. Hip hop is kind of like graffiti, sort of like demanding to be seen and heard, right? They're talking about issues that are real in their communities that aren't necessarily mainstream issues that the rest of America wants to be paying attention to, like what's happening in our inner cities and, systemic racism and things like that. So graffiti is also kind of in a similar vein, like speaking to some of these issues, right? And in the beginning with the graffiti, it is largely just like tagging your name, right? But as time goes on and they become more stylized, you do start to see a little bit more public messaging behind these tags and behind people painting in public spaces, which is how we get into what I'm going to define as street art, and I think many other people will define it as street art. I'm just going to take murals out of it. So we get into the 80s and into the 90s, and we start to see what we think of now as street art emerging, right? So hip hop is taking off, graffiti is spreading all over the world, and then we start to see more graffiti that has a message behind it. So you see Keith Haring, Jean-Michel Basquiat. These are big names that really kind of brought street art to the mainstream consciousness again. So they're using these public spaces to communicate social or political messages to a broader audience. So not just their names, not necessarily just for other writers, but for the public at large, right? There's major things happening in the world or happening in their own communities. We know Keith Haring was talking a lot about the AIDS epidemic at that time, or other, political and social issues that were happening. And being able to paint in public spaces without gatekeepers, without anyone limiting your ability to communicate, becomes a really powerful art form. And then you see with Keith Haring and Jean-Michel Basquiat, the beginning of the kind of mainstream fine art world starting to acknowledge this is an actual art form, right? Because prior to that, it's really just vandalism in most people's eyes, and still is today. And that's, again, kind of part of why I love this work and why I do the tours that I do and things like that, is just trying to change our perception of what graffiti is, because if it weren't for graffiti, we wouldn't have this mural exhibition, we wouldn't have SHINE, right? So it's an important part of the culture, and being able to honor that history, I think, is really important. Okay, and then continuing on into the 1990s, the early 2000s, we start to see Shepard Fairey and Banksy, right? So I feel like if you know nothing about any of this, you probably still know Banksy. He's just like this name that it's hard not to know, right? But I would consider them street artists. They start to really bring street art into the mainstream in ways that other artists hadn't really done before. Shepard Fairey with the Obey giant sticker, again, communicating these messages about capitalism, about consumerism, about authoritarianism, right? And starting to kind of like access people in these public spaces, which I love because, again, you see advertisements all the time, right? Everywhere we go, billboards in the subway stations in New York, right? Things are being sold to us all the time. So being able to kind of co-opt those spaces for artistic purposes or for social or political messaging is a really powerful tool. Banksy, I think, too, is like, because of his work, because of the anonymity, right? Like, he's never revealed his real name. I think there's a lot of speculation about who he is, but he's never revealed his true identity. But his work is, again, more image-based, and he's communicating really powerful messages in ways that I think are relatively easy to grab a hold of, right? And they just spread worldwide, a lot of political messaging. And then we also start to see the emergence of new mediums in this way, right? We have wheat paste, stencils, more stickers. So we've moved beyond just the kind of markers and aerosol tags. And really, both of those guys could be whole presentations in and of themselves, but for the purposes of this, that's just kind of a baseline for your understanding. This I just wanted to include. This is an example of a wheat paste. This is Jay Giroux, a local artist who started the Read movement many years ago, but essentially just like a paper poster that's been glued with usually like a homemade adhesive that you might see around town. Here we go. Oh, just kidding. So many images in here, I think it's loading slow. Okay, so then we kind of start to see the, as the street art pieces get to be more elaborate, eventually we're starting to see more whole murals happening, right? So in early 2000s, 2000 teens, you see some of these festivals start to pop up. And just the prevalence of street art in general, right, leads to more kind of harnessing of this art form, for better or for worse, but starting to be legal and commissioned more commonly. And then, ironically, you start to see murals be used as graffiti deterrent, right, which I think is kind of just this interesting evolution of the art form. But you see things like the Powwow Festival, which is now called Worldwide Walls, began around this time, early 2010-ish, 2014 in there. That's when SHINE started in 2015. And then I'll just talk a little bit about SHINE too, for anybody that isn't familiar, again, just connecting into the exhibition and also just to the history that got us to where we are today. But the SHINE Festival, this is our mission statement, really illuminating the power of public art, revitalizing areas, inspiring dialogue, uniting the community, and then really elevating the standards of art in St. Pete. So it's produced by the St. Petersburg Arts Alliance. We've produced 180 murals since 2015, and these are by local, national, and international artists. A lot of these artists that have been part of SHINE are really some of the best mural artists in the world that we've had the honor of being able to bring here or work with locally, many of whom you'll see represented in the exhibition here at the Dalí now. So SHINE was really special because of a couple different things that I think are worth mentioning, because the festival really celebrated art for the sake of art, not just commissioned murals for the sake of branding or marketing, but really celebrating these individual artists and their voices in a public space and how powerful that can be. I think of it as being a very artist-centric festival, which again isn't always the case with other mural programs, but we really always tried to prioritize the artist's creative expression and their experience here, whether they were local or not, but making sure that they were sort of the primary benefactor in some ways of the festival. Whereas a lot of times you're kind of aiming to sort of please the sponsors or please the property owners or something like that. We kind of always wanted to make sure that the artists themselves, first and foremost, got to do what they wanted to do and had a good experience. Again, we always had local, national, and international artists. Again, it's not always the case with other programs. A lot of them are maybe just locals or just visiting artists, but we really believed in that blend of all three. As far as the curation goes, really honoring a diversity of styles and voices and trying to always kind of expand that outdoor gallery with different perspectives. Again, honoring graffiti and the culture that built murals. And then always trying to find new walls so we can expand that outdoor gallery every year. This is just fun little before and after, because I'm a sucker for a good before and after. But this is Max Ansing from Chicago. This is SHINE 2023, which is year 9. And this is, Trinity Lutheran Church, which is kind of cool because, we really tried in terms of also getting diversity with our artists, but diversity with the properties that we're able to work with too, right? Like this church probably would not have otherwise been able to afford to get to mural, especially a mural artist of this caliber. So to be able to partner with them and bring them really high quality art that is truly this artist's voice in a public space is really, really powerful. And the church loved it too. I think Max went to church with them on Sunday when he finished painting too. And then why does public art matter? Again, just kind of looking at this in a very broad context. it's free and accessible to the public, right? This is a really powerful way of communicating our values in a public space for people that may not ever step foot inside of a museum, may not step foot inside of a gallery, may not even know that they would want to do something like that, or may not have the means to be able to do something like that. You can still communicate with them in very powerful ways. And again, thinking all the way back to like the origins of this art form of painting in public spaces as a way of communicating your cultural values and traditions, I think about that a lot. Like if suddenly St. Pete were to be, well, I wouldn't say under the rubble, because most likely we'd be underwater, but let's just say many years from now we were to like uncover all of these murals, you know, what would that say? What would that say about us? And what I love about the murals in St. Pete is that I think it would say that we really value good quality art, right? And so we're communicating with every one of these murals that goes up, we're communicating something about who we are, what we value, and I think that that's really important. Signals that we have a very vibrant city, right? It's a more enjoyable place to live because of all of this art. Kind of already said, reflect your community values. It also supports year-round tourism here in St. Pete, right? We know with the festival we would have, I think this last year we had almost 20,000 people that came out for the SHINE Festival, and that was just for the period of the festival itself, right? The other 11 months out of the year, people are coming here to visit and they're touring and they're looking at the murals all year round. And then they're also spending their money at all the businesses that surround those murals too, right? So it's a real economic benefit in addition to being something that beautifies the city, it actually has a legitimate economic value. And it just increases the quality of life for all of us. This is another mural from last year I included just because Naomi is also one of the artists you'll see upstairs. And this was her, this was a quote from her about her experience participating in SHINE, which I think is really powerful. I've read this before, but I think it's worth mentioning just to, I guess, humbly, not so humbly brag about what a great job SHINE has done over the years. But Naomi says she's participated in quite a few festivals over the years, and SHINE is by far the most well-organized and sophisticated event I've had the privilege of being part of. The hospitality and warmth from everyone involved made me feel appreciated and created an amazingly fun and rewarding experience. Throughout the festival, I had the opportunity to grow as an artist while making lifelong friends and unforgettable memories. Best of all, thanks to the seamless logistics and thoughtful planning, I was able to focus on my work and leave behind a piece of art that truly reflects the best of my abilities. SHINE Festival set a new standard for what an art festival can be. And then we see this evolution even further, right, into seeing murals being commissioned in museum settings like this one, right, which is a huge evolution if we think back to the days of graffiti in New York City, right? Here we are now. So murals are being recognized as a legitimate cultural art form. It's a way to reflect our current culture too, right? Like this is, I think, the first show of its kind at the Dalí. To have 13 living artists painting live inside the museum has never been done before. So really amazing opportunity, engages a whole new audience, right? I think a lot of times we say like it engages a younger audience. I don't even know that that's true, but it engages a different audience in many ways. When we do a lot of the tours that we do through Star Trolley, our audience is largely 60 plus, but still, I think it's a different audience than maybe who would otherwise be paying attention to art. And also we're seeing these museums and galleries embracing the studio or canvas work of mural artists or artists that were formerly graffiti writers. So a huge cultural shift, like I said, from this marginalized art form originally into being something that's very widely accepted. And there's pros and cons to that, right? I think depending on who you talk to, there's feelings about that and maybe sort of the sanitization of this art form that used to be, in some ways, is still very rebellious, very political, very deviant in some ways, and now it's sort of been like cleaned up and we're here in these beautiful spaces. But it's an interesting, and I think the other thing about it is like we're still sort of actively living in the evolution of these art forms, right? I think if we look back in another 50 or 100 years, we're gonna have a better sense of how all this played out, but it's still actively playing out now in real time. That's another piece by Tasco. That's the end of my presentation, but I would really encourage you to go check out the exhibition if you haven't already seen it. And again, just I hope that you leave here with a new appreciation for graffiti and street art, if that was something that you wasn't already on your radar, because if it weren't for that, we wouldn't be here today. We wouldn't have these beautiful murals, and I think that that's really important. So thank you all for being here. Are there any questions?
I will pass a mic. We just redid our AV system, and so I think we're learning the ropes here. But so that people who are joining us on the live stream can hear the question.
Thanks very much for that. It was great.
Thanks.
I'm new to St. Pete, new to SHINE. The murals that are around here are beautiful. Thank you for. Yeah. Okay. It's putting me on the spot. Okay. So. Yeah. Yeah.
Just shout it out.
Just shout it out.
So the question is really around the logistics of the SHINE Festival. I'm curious to know about like how it actually works. So how do you find your artists? How do you fund your artists? How does that work hand in hand with the city of St. Pete? How do you find your properties? Just like I understand it's a lot of information, but just broad.
Yeah. So it's a lot, and there's a team, right? So the city is a sponsor. We have some grants that we receive, and then a lot of it is corporate sponsorship in terms of the funding or individual donors. And then a lot of my job was really scouting out walls. I spent a lot of time just knocking on doors and trying to find properties that were a good fit for the festival. We were looking for ones that were primarily within the art districts, highly visible, few obstructions. We also had a curation team that was working pretty much year-round, looking at artists, talking about those artists, inviting them, kind of slowly putting together a lineup that we felt like was really well-rounded and diverse. So, and then there would be like a process of matching those up, right? And it's different every time. I mean, sometimes we're curating an artist specifically for a wall. Sometimes we have a wall and we're doing it the other way around. So it really just would kind of depend on who we were talking to, but those would be paired up in one way or another, right? Looking at the size of the wall, the scale, the location, the texture of the wall, all those things would be considered when we're placing people together. And then it was just a matter of lining everything up. Every artist would get a storage unit, every artist would get a lift, we'd take their paint orders in advance, and then everything would be organized and ready for them when they arrived at their wall. So I worked year round and at the end full time just preparing that, but also had a team of volunteers behind me that were also helping with all the logistics.
And how do we determine, sorry to follow up question, how do we determine what piece of art is acceptable? Like, do you have a consensus board, or is it you as a curator saying, I like this piece?
So we were selecting artists based on their portfolio. We didn't know what they were going to paint, and we didn't ask. And that's part of the beauty of SHINE, is that that's a really rare opportunity for an artist to be able to just do their art in a public space without having to go through that approval process. We had some high-level parameters like no nudity, no politics, and nothing overtly offensive. But we were really careful about who we were curating for that purpose. We wanted artists that we knew were going to take this responsibility seriously, were going to honor the opportunity to be working in a public space, and that their work was consistent, that you look at their portfolio, you have a really strong sense of what they're going to paint without seeing an exact rendering. And it's worked. For 10 years, we've never really had an issue with that.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? Yeah.
Just to follow up on you, Jenee. So some of these artists are the best artists in the world that do this kind of thing. So what is it about SHINE that attracts them here rather than all these other places where they may go?
Great question. So I think part of that is SHINE became known for our hospitality. We really would go above and beyond to make sure that the artists had whatever they need. And again, going back to that idea of it being a very artist-centric festival, we got their airfare, their hotel, their paint, their lifts. They got paid on top of all that. We would be really careful not to ask them to do more than paint their mural, right? They didn't have to be anywhere. They didn't have to be at any events. They didn't have to do anything extra. We really wanted them to just paint and get them set up to do the best possible work that they could. And that did a lot of the work for us, I think, in many ways. These artists would go back to their communities and be like, oh, SHINE's a good one to go do. Like, they're going to take care of you. You get to paint what you want to paint. So it over time, I think we had that reputation that people knew it was a good one to go to. Yeah.
Would you remind us of how long the artists had to paint their murals here?
Here they had like 1 to 2 weeks. Yeah, it's somewhere within there. Yeah. Yeah, definitely check that out. You'll see, I tried to include some of the artists in the slides. Like the very first slide, it's Lauren Y.S. She has a piece up there, Naomi Haverlin. So yeah, definitely check that out. Any other questions?
Do we have contact information for you?
I can get it for you, yeah.
And how to do the mural tour?
There are mural tours through Star Trolley. If you want to take a trolley tour, you can just go on their website and book that. I'm one of those guides. And then also Miss Crit, who is one of the mural artists upstairs. She's also one of the guides. And then another guy named Dan Wood. And then we also do walking and biking tours through Florida Craft Art. All that's on each of their websites. There's another hand. Yeah.
Did the artists have a preference on which wall they were going to paint on? How did you decide who paints what wall?
For the festival?
Yeah, did they care?
Yeah, they definitely cared. And we would try, again, it would depend on the walls that we had available, but like I would always try to give them options if I could, maybe 2 or 3 walls and then see. And a lot of times, like once they would agree to be in the festival, I would ask them like, what's your ideal wall? Like, let me go see if I can find the perfect wall for you. A lot of them would want like portrait style walls, which we just don't have a ton of those here in St. Pete. They tend to be more of those long horizontal walls. But just kind of understanding are they going to use aerosol? Are they going to use bucket paint? That'll determine a lot of which walls are even possible for them to paint. If the texture is too much, it's not going to be a brush painter. But we would definitely take their, they would ultimately get to decide which wall they are on in most cases. Mm-hmm.
Yes, I was wondering, murals are beautiful. Graffiti, questionable at times. Is there much damage to our murals here in St. Petersburg by people with graffiti?
Great question. No, not really. We've gotten really lucky. Like that's not the case in a lot of other cities. But here in St. Pete, the graffiti writers have been, by and large, very respectful of the art. I think it's interesting because there's sort of, even though graffiti is a very like kind of rebellious art form, there's actually a lot of structure and kind of rules built within it. And one of those rules is you're not really supposed to go over someone's art, especially if it's better than yours, right? So this like game recognized game. So we see that play out in St. Pete where like there's this one warehouse up on North MLK where it's like the whole side of the warehouse is just covered in graffiti. And then there's one mural there by Alex Pardee and it just stops. The graffiti stops and then it picks up again on the other side of the mural. Yeah, so we have had a few, I think of the 180 we've done, there's been like maybe 6 that have been tagged, and usually it's like years and years after the mural has been there. So yeah, by and large, it does serve as a graffiti deterrent in many ways. We've had pretty, and I think too, like because we've tried to honor the graffiti roots and we've tried to include graffiti writers and really celebrate a lot of the artists that we worked with started as graffiti writers, and that's such an important part of their history and of their art form, and really wanting to honor and celebrate that, I think has helped like with them not feeling like we're, stepping on their toes or anything like that. Yeah.
Jenee, of the 180, and I know a couple, but how many have you lost that have been painted over, or a building built against them, or?
I looked at that last year, and it was around 60, I think, that we had lost. Like pretty much every mural from the first year is gone, I think, except for one. The first couple years, we've lost a lot. But then especially like post-COVID, we started losing a lot of walls really quickly. Development was really booming. Whole buildings were getting knocked down, or new buildings, built up right against what was an empty lot. But yeah, I think last I counted, it was somewhere around 60 that are gone now, which is pretty good, actually, considering that amount. We have a lot of murals in St. Pete, and I don't know what the exact number is. We usually will say somewhere around 500 murals in St. Pete total. So it's constantly, changing. Some are going down, new ones are going up all the time, but somewhere around 500 total.
The
the Ricky Watts, that giant Ricky Watts that was painted over at the subsequent SHINE Festival. How do you deal with that? Because Ricky comes back. And I mean, was he okay with that, or?
Well, yeah, again, because this art form is temporary in nature, a lot of these artists are very comfortable with that idea. They don't expect their piece to last forever, right? If it's in a museum on canvas or something like that, it's a different expectation of its longevity. But being outside, most of them are very comfortable with that idea. There is sort of a proper protocol, though, in terms of communicating to them, like, hey, your wall is going to get covered up. You know, if they want to go get final photos or something like that, we try to give them some time to go out and like make sure they know, and other people might know if they want to share that the wall is going to be passed on. With SHINE, we would try not to cover up old walls, right? We always wanted to kind of just expand and leave the ones there if we could, but some of them just, the Florida sun is just brutal. They fade, they don't look great, or the wall itself is just such a great wall, it like kind of makes sense to rotate it out. But yeah, and then that in that specific example, it gave us kind of another reason just to bring Ricky Watts back and give him another wall, you know, which we also tried to do. If we were going to cover something up, we would try to bring somebody back if we could. Yeah.
So if some of these that are lost, I'm assuming there's photographs of them someplace. I know that there's these books of postcards of murals, which is kind of cool. Is there a catalog, or will there be a catalog that goes through all this stuff?
So you can see all of them online at the St. Peter Arts Alliance. We are also working on a book, like a coffee table book, that should be out, I don't know, either later this year or early next year, that will catalog all the murals that we did. So with SHINE 2, I didn't really talk about this, but we would always do our featured lineup that was usually like 16 artists, and then we would do a series of community projects called Bright Spots. So not all the Bright Spots made it into the coffee table book, but all the main artists on the main lineup of the featured ones are all in that coffee table book. And that also will have like the full history of how SHINE began, you know, bios about all the artists, different artist features. It's really, really a beautiful book. As soon as we get it out, it'll be for sale here at the Dalí and a bunch of other local outlets. And we did go through and get permission from every single artist to be included in that book, which was a nightmare. 2 more questions. Okay.
What metric does the city use to show that it has been an economic benefit and it's worth what they have already given, or should they give more, or should they give less?
Yeah, great question. So the primary thing has been the economic impact study that was done as part of a sponsorship that we received from Visit St. Pete Clearwater years ago. That economic impact study was really, really fascinating and kind of validated what we knew but didn't have a way of necessarily proving. But it was what that showed was that the majority of people attending the festival were coming in from outside Pinellas County, which really surprised us. We assumed it would be mostly locals. But I think it was like almost 70% of the attendees were from outside Pinellas County. And then of those attendees, it was like on average each day, they would spend like $65 a day at the restaurants and the bars and the galleries surrounding the murals. And so with the city, at that time, the city was putting in like $30,000 towards SHINE, and they were getting like a $2.1 million return on that. So the math is mathing quite well, yeah. Yeah.
Back in 2011, there was a document called Time is Art, and there was a muralist from New York City. His name was Chris Soria, and a community group of us were so taken with the movie and with Chris that we brought him to St. Petersburg. He did 4 murals here. 2 of them are on Wings Bookstore, which of course now vacant. And then he did one on 5th Avenue, which is no longer there. But the last one he did was on Sloppy Joe's. It's the turtle. When you look at the Sloppy Joe's, Chris Soria, that was his last one. But I bring this up because in that early years, it was the first year of SHINE. John Collins was the SHINE director, and he loved Chris, but he said we're not really going to include artists outside the city. And of course, that's changed, obviously. And it turns out that Chris has a pumpkin carving business in New York, so October is taken up for him. But if you don't follow many pumpkins, please do. When I'm so very successful. But I bring that up because he was such a contributor to the SHINE culture here, even though he was never included as a SHINE artist. And the last piece of that is that I went and talked to the manager at the Philmar about replacing the mural there because it got wiped out by the hurricane. And it's still there. It's not up to par. So there's a new project for Chris to come back, and Chris just loves it here. Chris Soria.
Awesome. Yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. Yes, wonderful. Thank you. All right, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you all for being here.